There is a silence that comes after the rain. Not the hush of an empty forest, nor the stillness of night, but something softer, worn by time, damp with memory. That is where this story begins. Not in the great cities of Edo or Kyoto, not in castles, shrines, or the parchment of history books, but in a humble wooden tea house tucked deep into the folds of a mountain path, somewhere between nowhere and somewhere, a place where the road curls like steam around rocks, where the map forgets to mark a name. I was not born there, nor did I plan to stay, but as many travelers in the Edo period would say, sometimes the road teaches us what stillness cannot. I arrived in the 7th month of the lunar calendar, a time of green fog and steady drizzle, when the mountain's breath lingers low across the mossy stones. My sandals were soaked from the walk. The straw hat did little to keep the water from running down my back. The paper umbrella I carried had long collapsed into silence. The tea house revealed itself the way some memories do, slowly behind a veil. Its roof was thatched and damp, a little uneven on the west side. A single pine tree leaned protectively over the structure. A faint curl of smoke lifted from its chimney into the pearl-colored air. No sign, no lantern, no bell. Only the smell of roasted barley and the gentle sound of water being poured from one vessel to another. Inside, the space was no larger than a modest room. Tatami mats worn smooth from many feet, a wooden counter with 2 shallow ceramic pots, a few bamboo stools along one wall, the ceiling low enough that taller guests would bow unconsciously, and light, soft and filtered, spilling in from washi-covered windows like memories half remembered. There, in that quiet shelter, I was offered tea. It was served without words, in a cup slightly chipped, steam curling upward like the tendrils of an old poem. The host, an older man with a graying topknot, said little. He wore simple robes, sleeves carefully rolled as he worked. His hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had poured tea 10,000 times, and yet with the gentleness of someone doing it for the first. I did not ask to stay the month, but somehow I did. And what followed was not a tale of events, not in the way that stories are usually told. There were no battles, no festivals, no declarations. Only the slow unfolding of days, the smell of rain, the sound of bamboo dripping after a storm, and the quiet people who came and went. Peasants, monks, messengers, samurai without armor. Each brought a story. None were told directly. But as the teacups emptied and were filled again, I came to understand them. That month in the mountain tea house remains with me, not as a single memory, but as a tapestry of silences, and the spaces between one sip and the next. If you'll stay with me a while, I'll share them, just as they were lived, softly and in no rush. Because in the rain, the past speaks quietly. I awoke to the sound of water. Not the sharp kind, not a storm striking a roof, nor a stream hurrying past rocks, but something softer. The subtle tap of droplets falling from bamboo gutters, the sigh of mist brushing over leaves, the intimate hush of the mountain still wrapped in clouds. I opened my eyes slowly, and the world returned not all at once, but in gentle layers, like paint washed across rice paper. First, the scent: damp wood, faint ash, and tatami, woven reeds softened by age and rain. Then the light, muted and pale, like a paper lantern seen through fog. And then sound again, that small, persistent rhythm of dripping water. I was still inside the tea house. The room around me felt half awake, as if it too were rising slowly from sleep. I pushed the quilt aside. It was a little heavier than it looked, its cotton stuffing uneven, perhaps hand-stitched long ago. I folded it with care. There's a certain peace in tending to small tasks in the morning, especially when no one is watching. The floor creaked beneath my steps, not loudly, but with familiarity. This was a house that had welcomed many before me. You could feel it in the floorboards, in the faint smoothing of the thresholds, in the way the edges of the mats curled just slightly. Outside the shoji screen, light shifted. It was not sunlight, not yet, but that silvery clarity that comes just after dawn, when the sky is more cloud than color. It painted the world with stillness. I slid the door aside gently and stepped into the front room. There, the host was already awake. He stood near the hearth, his silhouette framed against the low glow of the irori. A kettle simmered quietly over coals, and the fragrance of roasted tea leaves drifted into the air, earthy, slightly sweet, like the smell of rain warming on stone. He did not speak when I entered, nor did I. Instead, I sat cross-legged near the window, resting my hands on my knees, letting my breath settle with the quiet. There are few places where silence is allowed to exist fully, not as an absence, but as a presence in its own right. The tea house was such a place. The host moved slowly, carefully. He ladled water from the kettle with a long-handled dipper, its polished bamboo catching the glow of the fire. The water hissed softly as it met the tea bowl. Then came the whisk, delicate, rhythmic strokes, not hurried, not hesitant. The foam rose gently, like morning fog curling along a valley. When he turned, he carried the tea with both hands, the bowl plain and heavy, slightly chipped at the lip. It looked as though it had been used for decades, maybe longer, a quiet kind of beauty. He placed it before me with a subtle bow, and I returned the gesture, feeling the warmth of the gesture before the warmth of the cup. The tea was hot, just shy of burning. Its surface shimmered with a fine froth, green and gold at once in the morning light. I raised it, inhaled. The fragrance was grounding, earth and grass, the faint smoke of charcoal, and something else, something like memory. The first sip was sharp, not unpleasant, but attention-gathering. The second was smoother, and by the third, the bitterness had softened into warmth. I drank slowly, letting each mouthful linger. In that moment, I was not a traveler. I was not thinking of the road, or of time, or of where I might go next. I was simply present, my hands on the bowl, my breath matching the steam. Outside, the mountain breathed. The fog curled between trees, drifting in soft eddies over the stones. A single drop rolled from the end of the eaves and struck the wooden railing with a gentle plink. The sound echoed more than it should have. But here, in this place, even the smallest things were allowed to speak.
After some time, the host spoke, only once. He said, "The water is different here." His voice was quiet, as though it hadn't been used yet that day. I looked at him. He continued, "From the spring behind the house. It takes time to find it's here. Time gives it kindness." I nodded. We didn't speak again, but I remembered those words. Later that morning, I walked slowly around the grounds. The Teahouse sat near the bend of an old footpath, sheltered by tall cedar trees. There was a moss garden near the back, not cultivated in any formal way, but left to grow as it pleased, soft, uneven, like a green cloud resting on earth. Tiny mushrooms had sprouted near the base of a tree, and water clung to their caps like pearls. In the distance, the faint toll of a temple bell sounded, just once, carried on the air. The sky remained gray, but not heavy. There was light behind it, waiting. I returned inside and found the host washing the tea bowl. He did so without hurry, his movements slow, respectful, as if the bowl had a story of its own. I asked if he needed help. He shook his head. "Your task," he said gently, "is to drink." And so I did. Not just that morning, but every morning that followed. Each cup different, each one the same.
The rain returned in the late afternoon. It came softly, as though it had been waiting behind the clouds, watching the morning drift by. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady, unhurried drizzle, the kind that stays for hours without raising its voice. I sat near the threshold of the teahouse, a thin cup of barley tea cradled in my hands, watching the droplets gather on the pine needles before letting go. Each one fell in its own time, and with each, the world seemed to soften. The host sat across from me, tending the coals. He moved with the rhythm of a man who understood fire, not just how to feed it, but when to let it rest. He rarely looked outside. I often did. The path that led to the teahouse curved like a quiet question. Framed by trees, it seemed to hold its breath in the rain. Then a sound, not loud, but different. The hollow tuck of wooden sandals on stone, measured, deliberate. A figure appeared, moving slowly through the mist. He carried no umbrella, just a walking staff and a small cloth bundle tied across his back. His robes were dark, faded from travel and damp with rain. The wide-brimmed hat that shielded his head was fraying at the edges. A pilgrim. Not a monk exactly, though some might mistake him for one. His robes bore no temple crest. No scrolls or charms hung from his sash. Only a single string of worn beads around his wrist. He paused at the edge of the veranda, eyes lowered, water trailing from his sleeves. The host stood without a word and stepped forward. No formal welcome, no bow, just a gesture, a quiet motion of the hand that said, "You may enter." The pilgrim removed his sandals, left them beside the door, and stepped inside. The room seemed to adjust itself, as if making space for his silence. He did not ask for tea, but the host prepared it anyway. And as he did, the pilgrim lowered himself onto a cushion in the corner, his back straight, his hands resting in his lap. He did not speak, he did not fidget, he did not look around. He simply waited. When the tea was placed before him, he bowed low, deeper than most would, holding the bow for a long breath. Then he drank, slowly, carefully, each sip drawn as though it were a prayer. I watched him from across the room, but I did not speak either.
To do so felt like brushing dust from an untouched scroll. The host, too, returned to his seat. Together, the three of us sat. No one tried to shape the silence. It was enough just to be within it. Outside, the rain thickened. It drummed lightly on the roof, tapping its own rhythm, a lullaby for walls and wood and moss. In time, the pilgrim set the empty bowl aside. He removed the cloth from his back and opened it with care. Inside, neatly folded, was a small cloth, a wrapping furoshiki, pale goo, and beside it a bundle of charcoal sticks tied with twine. He placed them gently on the tatami, then slid them forward. An offering, perhaps, but the host did not touch them. Instead, he nodded once. The pilgrim bowed again, and without a word, leaned his staff against the wall and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, not exactly. His breathing changed, but his posture remained still, like a stone shaped by centuries of wind. He remained like that as the day dimmed. Light slipped from the corners of the room. The edges of things began to blur. The fire in the hearth glowed softer, and the shadows on the ceiling lengthened. The sound of the rain never stopped. Evening came, not with color, but with weight, a hush that pressed gently on the room, inviting every thought to settle. The host lit a single lamp, a small ondan, its paper sides browned with age. The glow inside it was gold, barely strong enough to cast a shadow. I sat with my back to the wall, legs stretched out before me, and watched the way the lamp's light caught the lines of the pilgrim's face. He was older than I had thought. Not by years, but by distance. His expression was not worn, but quiet, like a place few people had reached. Eventually, he opened his eyes. He looked toward the hearth, then at the lamp, then down at his hands. He folded them slowly and whispered, not to me, not to the host, but perhaps to himself. Even in rain, the path remains. I do not know what he meant. Perhaps it was a proverb, perhaps a memory. He said nothing else that night, but the room felt different with him in it, not fuller, just more still. When it was time to rest, he rolled out a thin mat near the doorway, close enough to hear the rain's descent, but far enough to keep his presence light. He lay down without ceremony, his walking stick beside him, and closed his eyes once more. The host extinguished the lamp, and in the dark, only the faint scent of tea and pine remained.
The pilgrim left before dawn. I woke to the sound of cloth being folded. In the faint half-light of morning, he knelt near the threshold, methodically wrapping his few belongings, his staff, his beads, the furoshiki he had used as a pillow. His movements were careful, precise, as if the ritual of departure was as important as the journey itself. The rain had stopped, but the world remained soaked in silence. Moss along the path shimmered faintly, and the trees seemed heavier with water. The air carried that scent particular to the morning after rain, rich, earthen, with a trace of cedar and ash. The host nodded as the pilgrim passed him. No words exchanged, just a deep bow, and then he was gone, his figure quickly swallowed by the rising mist. I watched the footpath until it became only a memory in the fog. The teahouse returned to its usual quiet, like a bowl set gently on a table, still but not empty. Later that morning, I helped the host sweep the veranda. He handed me a small broom woven from rice straw, its bristles softened from use. We worked slowly, in silence, clearing the fallen pine needles and droplets that had collected in the corners. I asked him whether many people passed this way. He said simply, "Not many, but always someone." By midday, the clouds had begun to thin. Pale light filtered through the canopy above, and the steam from our barley tea seemed to rise a little higher, as if encouraged by the sun's return. And that was when we heard it, the soft clatter of wheels. Not a cart exactly, but a hand-drawn wagon. Its wooden frame creaked under the weight of something unseen, its axle protesting each dip in the uneven path. Then footsteps, lighter than the Pilgrim's, quicker, unmeasured. A girl appeared at the bend in the road. She was perhaps 16, maybe a little older. Wearing a deep indigo kimono, hem muddied from the trail. A short jacket tied loosely at her waist, sleeves rolled slightly above the wrist. She had tied her hair in a simple knot, though strands had escaped in the wind. Behind her, a small cart covered in canvas, lashed with rope and decorated faintly with faded merchant stamps. She paused when she saw us. Her face, flushed from effort and weather, held both caution and relief. The host stood first and walked to the edge of the veranda. She bowed quickly, then again lower this time. When she spoke, her voice was clear but slightly hoarse. "My father has gone ahead. I was meant to catch up." The host nodded and gestured inward. She hesitated only a moment, then climbed the steps and removed her sandals. I moved aside to give her space, but she didn't sit right away. Instead, she turned and began to unload the cart. A few wrapped bundles tied in patterned cloth, sacks of barley, a small chest, and something carefully wrapped in straw matting. The host said nothing, nor did he stop her. When the last item was placed against the wall, she stood straight and exhaled sharply. "I thought the road would be quieter," she said, half to herself. And then at last she sat, knees tucked beneath her, shoulders drawn slightly inward from fatigue. The host prepared tea without a word, as he always did, his hands steady, each movement drawn from years of repetition. I watched her as she sipped. She drank more quickly than the Pilgrim had, but with no less gratitude. When the bowl was empty, she held it for a moment, turning it in her hands. "I've never had tea alone before," she said, a quiet observation, not a complaint. The host placed a small plate beside her, 2 pieces of kuzumochi, soft and translucent, dusted with roasted soybean flour. She blinked in surprise. "Truly?" she asked. He did not answer. Instead, he returned to the hearth. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. When she was done, she folded her hands and bowed low. It was the kind of bow one makes not just for kindness received, but for kindness remembered. She remained with us for several hours. Sometimes she spoke, lightly, sparingly. She told us her father was a traveling seller of teas and paper goods, and that he had gone ahead to a nearby village for trade. They had separated briefly so she could follow with the heavier cart. She did not say why she had fallen behind, nor did we ask. As the afternoon light shifted, she unpacked one of the chests. Inside were delicate fans, each painted with scenes of birds and flowers, rivers and cranes, clouds in flight. She held them up one by one, the way a child shows something made by hand, not to sell, but to share. The host examined them with interest, but made no comment. I asked if she had painted them. She laughed gently. "No," she said, "but I watch the painter. Maybe I've learned a little just by watching." We let the silence resume after that. Eventually, she repacked the chest and stood. She adjusted the canvas over her cart, tightened the rope with practiced hands, and tied the knot twice for certainty. Before leaving, she turned back and bowed again.
"Thank you," she said, "for letting me rest." The host offered no reply. He simply handed her a small pouch, a cloth-wrapped packet of roasted tea leaves. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry, but instead she smiled. She took the packet with both hands and slipped it inside her sleeve. And then she was gone, cart and all, her wheels clattering softly down the path. The silence returned, but this time it felt touched by laughter.
There are days when nothing happens, and they are not wasted. This day was like that. The morning was pale, washed in the color of stone and wet pine. The rain, which had been steady in recent days, had withdrawn into the mountains, leaving behind a world rinsed clean. No footsteps came up the path, no carts, no sandals, no worn robes moving through the mist. Only stillness, the kind that does not ask to be filled. I woke later than usual, stirred not by noise, but by the scent of the hearth. The coals had been kindled early. Smoke drifted faintly through the room, carrying the sharp scent of cedar wood and the familiar whisper of roasted barley. The host was already sweeping. He moved through the veranda with slow, gliding strokes. The broom left small trails in the damp grain of the wood, and I noticed how carefully he moved the fallen leaves, not sweeping them out in a rush, but guiding them as if they were part of the house itself. I offered to help, but he shook his head gently. "It's a day for silence," he said. His voice sounded softer than usual, as though even he didn't want to wake the air. I sat beside the window and let the morning arrive in pieces. A droplet slid down the shoji panel, its path as meandering as thought. Outside, a bird, a warbler perhaps, called once, then fell silent. The wind was low, barely enough to stir the bamboo near the stream. I watched the host prepare tea. There was no guest to serve, no ritual to observe, and yet he made it as if someone were watching. The kettle hissed. The ladle dipped. The foam rose slowly in the bowl. He whisked it only briefly, then set it on the low table in front of the hearth. It sat there untouched. Steam rose into the silence. I realized then that the tea was not for anyone, or rather, it was for everyone, for the house, the wood, the mountain, for memory itself. Later, I walked behind the tea house, through the moss path I had discovered the day before. It was quiet there too. The garden did not speak. It breathed. The moss was thickest near the stone lantern, which leaned just slightly, its base worn uneven by years of soft rain and sunless days. A small spider had woven a web inside its hollow. The strands caught what light there was, turning silver for an instant before fading back into nothingness. I sat there for some time. There is no hour in the garden, no movement that demands notice, and yet everything is in motion. A single leaf twitched on a branch, as if remembering wind. A droplet of water clung to the underside of a camellia leaf, heavy with the decision to fall. And then it did. It landed without a sound, but somehow I heard it. Back in the tea house, the host had begun his daily cleaning. He wiped the shelves with cloths that had been washed thin by years. He polished the kettle, even though it did not shine. He realigned the bowls on the shelf, not because they were disordered, but because the act of alignment is a kind of conversation with space. He took down the old scroll that hung in the alcove and unrolled a different one from a wooden tube.
This one was simpler. It bore only 3 characters: Ichinichi Ikai, one encounter, one moment. I had seen the phrase before, but never had it looked so quiet. We sat for tea without speaking. The host poured me a cup, not the matcha of the early mornings, but genmaicha, green tea with toasted rice. The flavor was mellow, almost nutty, and lingered on the tongue like wood smoke on cloth. I asked him once, "What do you do when no one comes?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the door, the same door through which pilgrims and merchants and weathered travelers had entered, each carrying silence like a different shape. And then he said, "I listen to the house. It remembers more than I do." After tea, I returned to the veranda and watched the sky shift. The clouds thinned slowly. Patches of blue opened like shallow pools. The wind stirred at last, just enough to lift a paper scrap from the edge of the cart path. It danced once, then settled again. No one came that day. No one arrived. No new stories, no exchanges, no footsteps to mark the floor. And yet, I do not remember it as empty. I remember the sound of leaves being swept, the quiet taste of roasted tea, the rhythm of cloth against wood, the patient gaze of the host, and the silence that stayed with us like a guest who never left.
The 5th morning came with light. Not bold light, not warm, but a pale brightness that gently touched the edges of things. The mist had lifted just enough for the shapes of trees to appear in full, their trunks tall and dark, like quiet sentinels along the path. There was no rain that morning, not even the memory of it, only a faint coolness that drifted in from the north. I had begun to recognize the rhythm of the house, the slow hum of the kettle coming to boil, the soft brush of cloth over wood as the host cleaned the alcove, the scrape of a stool slightly adjusted by habit, not need. I had also begun to learn the silences, the difference between a silence that welcomed thought and one that asked it to wait. We were seated at the edge of the veranda, sipping tea, when we heard it. Footsteps, quick ones, not the measured pace of the pilgrim, nor the light tread of the merchant's daughter. These steps were heavier, controlled but clipped. Then came the voice, not raised but present. "Pardon, may I rest here a while?" The voice belonged to a young man, no older than 30, dressed in a faded brown kimono, with one sleeve tied back and the other torn slightly at the seam. A straw hat hung from his back, its rim wet with dew. His face was calm, but his eyes flickered, not in fear, but in constant attention. And at his side, a sword. Not ostentatious, no lacquered scabbard or elaborate crest, but it was real, and worn the way only those who had used it wore such things, not for display, but for habit. The host bowed gently and gestured to the mat near the doorway. The samurai removed his sandals. Then, without hesitation, he removed his sword. He laid it beside the entrance, parallel to the wooden threshold, the blade turned inward. A gesture of peace, a statement without words. Only then did he sit. His movements were efficient but respectful. He folded his legs, placed his hands upon his knees, and exhaled once, long and slow. The host prepared tea. There was no ceremony, but somehow everything was ceremonial. The samurai drank without speaking.
He sipped slowly, as if measuring not just the flavor, but the moment. I watched him carefully. His clothes were travel-worn. The hem of his robe was crusted with dried mud. His sandals had cracked along one edge. And his right sleeve, the one he had left tied back, revealed a thin scar running from elbow to wrist. He did not hide it, nor did he show it. When he placed his empty cup down, he bowed to the host and said simply, "You have a good house." The host inclined his head, but said nothing. There was a long pause. Then the samurai reached into his side pouch and drew out a folded piece of paper. It was crinkled, its edges soft from many readings. He unfolded it on the low table. It was a map, hand-drawn, annotated in brush calligraphy. Not a military map, but a personal one. Several paths had been marked, some crossed out. I saw him trace one with his finger, then stop. "You know this route?" he asked quietly, pointing to a thin line that cut through the hills. The host leaned closer, studied it, and nodded once. "It still exists," he said, "but it's overgrown. Few use it now." The samurai nodded, not in frustration, but in understanding. He folded the map again, slowly. "I prefer unused paths," he said. "They leave more space for thought." Then he reached into his pouch again and drew out a small cloth, a wrapping for travel provisions. Inside, 3 dried plums and a triangle of rice wrapped in bamboo leaf. He opened it, paused, then offered it to the host. The host accepted only the plums. The rice was left for the samurai. The exchange was brief, but felt ancient. 2 men sharing food, not from bounty, but from mutual understanding. The samurai ate in silence. Outside, a wind stirred the cedar branches. A single yegel leaf fluttered across the veranda and landed at his feet. He watched it for a moment, then picked it up and turned it over between his fingers. He did not speak again for a while. When he finished, he rose slowly, brushed his knees, and walked to the threshold. There he retrieved his sword. He turned it over, inspecting the cord wrapping on the hilt, then, without tying it to his side, he held it against his forearm and bowed. To walk unguarded is a luxury. And then, with a half-smile that faded as quickly as it came, he stepped off the veranda and disappeared down the side path. Not the one most traveled, but the one the host had mentioned. We watched the trail for a long time after he had gone, not to see if he returned, but because something remained there. Not presence, but weight. As though the silence had grown slightly larger.
Some mornings arrive with intention. They do not burst in like sunlight or arrive dripping from the eaves. They step lightly, like an ink brush drawn across paper, measured, certain, and quiet. This morning was such one. I awoke early, before the kettle began its first sigh, and sat by the window wrapped in a shawl, watching the horizon pale from deep indigo into ash-gray. No rain had fallen in the night, and yet the world seemed soaked with stillness, the kind that doesn't cling but rests softly on the shoulders of trees and stones. The host moved through the tea-house with practiced grace. He adjusted the hearth, brushed dust from the scroll alcove, and replaced a single piece of charcoal with a new one from a stack wrapped in straw. He did not speak, but his silence had grown more familiar. By now, I had come to understand that his language was space. The pauses between gestures, the order of tasks, the way a bowl was turned slightly before it was placed.
And so, when he paused at the veranda and tilted his head slightly, I knew before I heard the footsteps that someone was coming. The footfalls were softer this time, not cautious, but known. The pattern was light, uneven in rhythm. Then the figure appeared, rounding the curve in the path with the morning at her back. The merchant's daughter had returned. Her clothing was different this time, a plum-colored kimono, faded slightly at the sleeves, tied with a soft green sash. Her hair was neater, bound in a proper bun with a single silver pin. She walked without the cart, carrying only a narrow bundle under her arm, wrapped in indigo cloth and tied with red string. When she reached the veranda, she bowed, not quickly, not deeply, but as one bows to an old friend, whose name may be forgotten, but whose presence is remembered. The host nodded and stepped aside. She removed her sandals and entered quietly. There were no formal greetings, but her smile, even brief, seemed to lighten the corners of the room. She sat in the same place she had before, tucking her knees beneath her, hands resting gently in her lap. She placed the wrapped bundle beside her, but did not open it. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment and breathed deeply, as if returning to a place long imagined, now real again. The host prepared tea. This time, he served hojicha, roasted green tea with a deeper aroma. Its scent drifted through the room like warm smoke. She received the bowl with both hands, turning it slightly before the first sip. After a few quiet moments, she spoke. "I told my father about this place," she said. He smiled as she said it, but I sensed something else beneath the words, a tone just shy of wistful. She set the bowl down and reached her bundle. Unwrapping it slowly, she revealed a stack of handmade paper, thick, textured, and slightly irregular, not for letters, but for painting. Beneath it, she removed a slender box. From it, a brush and 3 small porcelain dishes filled with dried ink blocks. The host did not react. He simply made space. She poured a small amount of water into each dish. The ink softened slowly. Then, in silence, she picked up the brush and began to paint. No words passed between us. We only watched. Her movements were slow, each stroke deliberate, unhurried. She painted not to impress, but to listen, to herself, to the moment, to the tea house. On the first sheet, she drew a pine tree. The lines were spare, crooked in the way that real trees are. She left space around the trunk, letting the white of the paper carry the mist. The second was a stream, curving between stones. She used water more than ink, blurring the boundaries. On the third, she paused. She dipped the brush once, twice, then drew a tea bowl. Not ornate, just a single bowl, resting, empty, yet full of presence. I watched the host glance at it. His expression did not change, but I sensed a stillness in him. When she finished, she placed the paintings beside the hearth, letting them dry in the warmth of the fire. Then she bowed, not to either of us, but to the room itself. After some time, she gathered the papers. She did not take them with her. She stacked them neatly in the corner of the alcove, beneath the scroll that read, "One encounter, one moment." She rose and said, "I've left them here. Maybe someone else will see them." The host nodded. She stepped outside, slipping her sandals on slowly, and paused on the veranda. The morning light had brightened. Birdsong filtered in through the cedars. She looked back once, but said nothing more. And then, as before, she disappeared around the bend. The room seemed different once she had gone, Not louder, not quieter, just wider somehow, as if something had opened. The host returned to the hearth, and I returned to my tea. The 3 paintings remained where she had placed them. They were not signed, but each held a kind of breath, not made of ink, but of memory.
The 7th day did not arrive with fanfare. There were no footsteps on the path, no kettles boiling too soon, no voices murmuring behind paper screens. Instead, it began with wind. Not strong wind, but the kind that rustles gently through high branches, tugging at the tips of things, like a child asking to be noticed. I heard it before I saw it. A soft shiver in the tall cedar needles, a scattering of dry pine cones on the ground, a delicate knock of bamboo stalks swaying near the garden wall. When I slid open the shoji screen, the air felt different, cooler. Not sharply, not enough to reach for another layer, but enough that I paused, enough to notice. Autumn had arrived, not by calendar, but by presence. The host had already begun his morning ritual. He wore an extra layer over his kimono, a haori jacket, simple and dark, its edges worn at the cuffs from many seasons. The hearth fire was slightly larger this morning. The kettle sat lower, closer to the coals. Steam curled upward with more determination, as if it too knew the season had changed. He didn't mention it, but his gestures had shifted, slightly slower, slightly steadier, as if moving in harmony with a world that was beginning to slow. Breakfast was miso broth with thin slices of daikon, a few pickled plums, a bowl of rice that had cooled slightly by the time I ate it. The flavors felt different today, not because they had changed, but because I had. After breakfast, I stepped outside. The garden was still, but in the stillness, I noticed more. The moss had darkened, deeper green in the shaded corners. A single white mushroom had appeared beneath the camellia bush. The spider's web in the stone lantern had been repaired, its new threads glistening in the angled light. And on the stones near the back path, a single red maple leaf. It lay flat, its edges curled slightly from dryness. The color was deep, the red of lacquer or old silk, its veins dark as ink. I stood for a long while looking at it. There is something about the first red leaf. It does not signal urgency. It does not cry out. It merely speaks. It is time. Back inside, the host had begun tending to the winter cloths. He opened a cedarwood chest tucked beneath the shelf and removed several neatly folded futon covers. Each was wrapped in cotton bags and scented faintly of dried orange peel and cedar shavings. I watched as he aired them by the veranda, hanging them across the wooden railing, beating the dust out with a bamboo paddle. He worked slowly, without force. Each motion sent small puffs of dust into the sunbeams, where they danced for a few moments before disappearing. Later, he wiped the paper windows with a damp cloth. He checked the shoji frames for tears, and in one corner replaced a panel with new washi, its surface crisp and translucent. I offered to help, but he declined with a small shake of the head. "This is the house preparing for quiet," he said. I did not ask what he meant, but I understood. The afternoon passed with no arrivals, no guests, only the kettle's steady rhythm, the smell of toasted rice tea, and the sound of wind moving through the cypress trees. I took out a brush and tried to draw. I had seen the merchant's daughter do it, her hands confident and fluid, but mine were hesitant. I drew the red leaf. It did not come out well. The lines were too defined, the silence missing. I set the paper aside and watched the light change. By late afternoon, the sun angled through the eastern trees, casting long shadows across the tatami floor. They moved slowly, like ink bleeding across a scroll. The host lit the first lantern early. Its glow did not compete with the daylight, but added to it, a soft gold that made the air feel warmer than it was. He brought out a tray of roasted chestnuts and placed them between us without a word. We ate slowly. They were slightly sweet, with a soft crunch at the edge. They tasted like smoke and memory. And then, the sound of geese, faint, high above. We stepped outside. They moved in a crooked line across the sky, their wings cutting through the fading blue. The host watched them for a long while, his arms crossed loosely, his gaze somewhere far beyond their flight. And then he turned and went back inside. That evening, I sat alone by the fire, listening to the wind grow still. No guests had come, and yet the house felt full, not with noise, not with stories, but with the quiet unfolding of change. I fell asleep with a blanket pulled higher over my shoulders. Outside, the red leaf rested where it had fallen. It would not stay long, but tonight it was enough.
The 8th morning returned to gray. After 2 days of brightness, the clouds gathered again, but without threat. It was the kind of sky that feels like soft wool, gentle, textured, thick with silence. The air was damp, but not cold, just cool enough to turn the breath visible. It curled upward in thin spirals, joining the steam from the kettle inside the hearth. I was sitting by the shoji screen, a bowl of genmaicha in hand, when the sound arrived. Not footsteps, not wheels, not voices. Just a faint note. Long, drawn out, low as the trunk of a cedar, soft as fog against fabric. It came from somewhere beyond the bend in the path, not far, but not near. A bamboo flute, the sound of the shakuhachi. The host heard it too. He paused with his broom in hand, head tilted. The note bent slightly, as though turning around a thought, then rose into stillness again. We waited. The music stopped, and then footsteps, slow, measured, dragging slightly in the gravel. The figure that appeared around the curve was not young. His hair was white, gathered in a short knot. His robes were layered, light cotton wrapped under wool, faded blue and deep gray. He carried no pack, only a long cloth roll tied at one end, and the flute, which hung loosely from his hand. He wore no straw hat. His eyes, clouded with blindness, moved but did not see. Yet he walked without hesitation. The host stepped to the veranda and bowed. I followed. The man returned the bow, then reached forward with practiced grace, finding the edge of the step. He removed his sandals slowly, tucked them together neatly, and entered. He said nothing. The host guided him to a cushion near the hearth. He sat, and the house grew even quieter. The flute rested beside him. He placed it gently on the mat, as one might rest an old friend. The host began tea, not matcha, not roasted blends, but a clear infusion of dried yuzu peel and kombu, a drink both cleansing and comforting. Its fragrance filled the space, a soft citrus warmth that mingled with the scent of firewood. When served, the blind man bowed once and drank slowly, with both hands around the cup. He did not speak, but in the silence I felt something unfolding. Not story, not memory, just presence. After tea, he reached for the flute. His fingers traced its length with reverence. Then, lifting it to his lips, he played. The sound was breath, low and wavering, not music in the formal sense, but sound shaped by silence. It rose like mist, spilling into corners, wrapping itself around the beams and bowls and long wooden bones of the house. The notes paused often, hanging in the air like unanswered questions. It was the kind of music that did not ask to be heard, only to be held. Even the fire listened. Outside, the first drops of rain returned, barely audible, like ink falling on dry paper. The music continued for several minutes, or perhaps hours. Time loosened its grip. And then it stopped. The man lowered the flute, placed it once more on the mat, and bowed deeply. No words followed. The host rose and placed a small square of folded cloth in the musician's hand. A gift, perhaps. I never saw what was inside. The man touched it gently, then tucked it into his sleeve. He stood, turned, and walked slowly back toward the threshold. Before stepping out, he turned his clouded eyes toward the alcove. Though he could not see it, the scroll there read, "One lifetime, one meeting." He bowed once more, and then he left. The sound of his steps faded into the mist. But for a long time afterward, the air inside the tea house still held the shape of his notes. We said nothing. There was nothing to add. The fire cracked once, and outside the rain fell, soft, persistent, like a song you forget but hum long after.
The morning of my departure was not marked by anything unusual. There was no farewell, no closing of doors, no final bow that held too long. The sky was low and heavy with cloud, but no rain fell. Only that strange brightness, the kind that makes every surface glow slightly from within, the kind of day that looks like memory, even while you are still living it. I rose early, though not before the host. He had already begun boiling water, its gentle murmur rising from the hearth like breath. He did not ask if I was leaving. I did not announce it. But we both knew. There are silences that carry more than absence. They carry understanding. He served me one final bowl of tea. It was sencha this time, light, sharp, with a note of grass and new leaves. Different from the teas of before. It felt like a beginning. I drank slowly, savoring the edges of the taste, letting the warmth settle into my chest. The host placed a folded square of cloth beside me. Inside, I later found a packet of dried tea leaves, a single strip of paper with a brush-drawn character. Stillness. That was all. I returned the cloth to the table and bowed low and long. When I rose, he did not look away. His face was unchanged, and yet I saw something in his expression, a softness perhaps, or simply reflection. I stepped out onto the veranda. The boards creaked beneath my feet, familiar now. My sandals, once soaked on arrival, had dried and hardened slightly, like bark curled after a fire. The path ahead was the same as before, winding,
gravel-lined, curving into the forest. But the way I looked at it had changed. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the trees. The red maple leaf from a few days ago had disappeared, carried by wind or time or neither. Only a faint stain remained on the stone where it had rested, as if even color knew how to fade gently. I adjusted my pack, lightly weighted. I took a breath, the kind that fills not just the lungs, but the body. And then I walked. Not quickly, not slowly, just forward. I did not look back, but in my mind I held the sound of the teahouse, not the walls or the fire or the kettle, but the stillness between them. The memory of the pilgrim's silence, the brushstroke of the merchant's daughter, the pause in the samurai's voice, the breath in the blind man's song. All of it remained. They had not stayed, nor had I, but something had. That quiet, that stillness, a kind of warmth that no fire could create. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees leaned closer. The fog gathered at my feet. The road whispered beneath each step. And behind me, somewhere just out of sight, the kettle grew silent. But I knew, even long after the tea had cooled, even after the leaves had settled at the bottom of the bowl, the warmth of that place would remain in me. And in this telling, it remains for you too. Whenever the rain returns, whenever silence finds you, whenever steam curls above a waiting cup, remember the teahouse and listen.